modern enemies to lovers type stories or antagonism to lover really rely on, especially the female main character, just falling in love with the man while he is actively being shitty towards her. Hello friends, my name is Marines, and today we're talking about Pride and Prejudice. I recently was asking for questions so that I could do a Q&A video. I will put a link to one of the places where I'm collecting questions right here on YouTube, but I got a number of them across all of the places that I asked like what my favorite book of all time is, or like my universal recommend, or the book that I could read over and over again. And the answer to all of those questions is and has remained the same for a very long time now, and that is, of course, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. It is my favorite book of all time. I first read Pride and Prejudice when I was in the 9th grade. I was 15 years old, and I picked it up not for class, but because we did an accelerated reader program, which was a program where you picked a book and it had a certain number of points assigned to it. And so my method was always to go for the books that had the highest number of points. That year, I also read Jane Eyre and Anna Karenina. So I was going for the chunky classics or the things that were rated higher because they were a little bit more complex. And I picked up Pride and Prejudice and absolutely fell in love. Throughout high school and college years, I will say that I reread Pride and Prejudice maybe once a year or once every other year. But for the past decade at least, that has been at least once a year. And since 2020 onwards, it has been multiple times a year. And this never gets old to me. I love this book so much. And every time I read it, I have the dual sensations of it just being really comfortable and something to ease into, but also something about it always stands out to me, right? There's always something new to sort of like chew on for me, which makes it an absolutely perfect kind of story to reread. Of course, I also love the adaptations. I watch the 1995 and 2005 adaptations pretty regularly, but I will also throw in the 1980 version in there every once in a while just to keep it spicy. And so as somebody who has consumed the story again and again and again, and in its multiple adaptations, I wanted to spend today, which is, as I am recording this, Pride and Prejudice Day. It was published on January 28th, 1813, talking to you about what I think people get wrong about Pride and Prejudice. And which really is just me talking about some of the details that I love in the story and how they compare sometimes to adaptations or interpretations. I'm not any kind of Austen professional, but I do play one on TV. Number one, the Bennett women are baddies. They're hot, okay? The 2005 cast generally is it's a stacked cast, and they are also very good looking. But I remember when Keira Knightley was cast that people were like, no, she's too hot. She's too hot to play Lizzy. And so they kind of frumped her up even in the styling and stuff, which I think misses a point about the Bennett sisters, because every new person that enters this village, they hear about how good looking these women are. By reputation, they are known as good looking women, starting with Mrs. Bennett, who was in fact so good looking that she like bamboozled Mr. Bennett into a marriage that was beneath his station. She was so hot that he didn't realize like how silly and kind of stupid she was until they were in the marriage, and he was like, oh. She's hot. Her daughters are hot. Lizzy also gets proposed to by multiple men, and like all of the like young major male characters that she comes across, with the exception of Mr. Bingley, like fall for her. You have Mr. Collins who proposes, Mr. Wickham who really likes her, Colonel Fitzwilliam who's also like, damn, I wish I wasn't poor, and then Mr. Darcy. So she's pulling. Anytime that we hear something sort of disparaging about Lizzy and her own beauty, it is through the perspective of either like Mr. Darcy or Caroline Bingley for sort of looking down on her. And that's a perspective we can't quite trust, right? These two people, especially at the beginning of the story, and then Caroline Bingley as she goes on, have very vested interests in looking down on this woman, but she is pretty. And so much so that Darcy, like by repeated exposure, as much as he wants to hold on to this like prejudice against her, it's almost like he can't help himself. And of course he finds her personality like like so different and so engaging. She jokes with him, she laughs, she smiles, and it's something that really catches his attention to the point where he has to admit to himself and he has to sort of like rework his idea about her own attractiveness. So yes, I said what I said, and any adaptation that isn't cowardly and is going to commit to the source material has to give us a Bennett family of women who are total baddies. Mary just has glasses on. Number 2, I think that Lizzy plays the piano just fine. One of my favorite details to track across the adaptations is how well Lizzy plays the piano. 2005 gives us the version of Lizzy that plays the piano the worst. And my interpretation of the text is that Lizzy plays the piano just fine. She's not exceptional by any means, but again, our 2 harshest critics in the work, which include Darcy and Lady Catherine, both say that she plays fine. And in fact, that whole evening, they ask her to keep playing. And if you've ever heard someone play the piano badly, like nobody's gonna be like, yeah, please keep playing. It is not a pleasant experience. So the fact that she feels comfortable playing in front of large parties, the fact that people like can listen to her with enough enjoyment to ask her to continue to play. Like, she plays the piano fine. She's by no means a prodigy. She could probably practice more and be even better, but she's good at it. Number 3, people don't understand Mr. Darcy, and what makes this antagonism to lovers arc one of the best ones ever done, and what makes it stand the test of time, and what makes it appeal to readers. And everybody wants to do that trope, that antagonism or enemies to lovers, without understanding what makes it so successful in something like Pride and Prejudice. I think that this is probably especially true because we, as people who have experienced the story sort of on the other end of it, have all kinds of tender, loving feelings for Darcy by the end of the book. So I think a lot of times in pop culture and in memes and things along those lines, he gets mischaracterized as sort of like socially awkward, right? Which he is in some regards, but that's not the extent of what his character is. He isn't just socially awkward. At the beginning of Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Darcy is both proud and prejudiced. He actively looks down on Lizzy and her family, and his biggest problem isn't shyness, it's arrogance. And we see this so well exemplified in his first proposal, the way that he approaches it, the way that he is sure that he is going to get accepted, so it doesn't even cross his mind to package this proposal in anything but like the deepest of his honesty, and all of that honesty coming in arrogance and like, I like you against my better judgment. We at that point are reaching the pinnacle of like the worst that we can think about Darcy, right? This is the moment that sort of proves all of the worst things that we've heard about this man up to this point, right? All of Lizzy's own prejudices against him are being proved right in this moment that's supposed to be really loving and tender and comes off completely the wrong way. I do think that in the 2005 adaptation, we do get more of a very awkward sort of like oopsie daisies. I didn't mean to say that. I'm sorry I'm saying this kind of thing. Where in the text itself, like Darcy is literally changing colors. He's so furious in this moment when he gets rejected. And when he goes back and he writes a letter to Lizzy to clear his name, he starts it by being like, and I'm not sorry, and I do it again, bop bop kind of thing. He doesn't fully see that he is wrong right at that moment or when he has written the letter, but that is the point where we start to sort of unravel and change Mr. Darcy so that he has the fullness of an arc. What makes this a satisfying antagonist to lovers story is that Mr. Darcy changes. He hears what Lizzy has said about him and he goes about like making sure that he addresses all of her complaints. By the time that they meet again at Pemberley, he is putting actual effort into making sure that he is polite, that he is gentlemanly, that he is treating her aunt and uncle well. Like, he understands where he went wrong and he is willing to change for her and to address all of the things that she said against him that he then later reflects on and sees she had a point. And of course, later Lizzy realizes that while she may have had a point about the mode of his declaration, she also was sitting in a lot of her own pride and prejudice. Her pride was wounded because of the things that he said about her family, which were not wrong. And she was prejudiced against him because she believed Mr. Wickham, who she thought was too hot to lie to her. Like, would that man lie to her? He's so hot. And so she was also wrong, but they both realize those things and they change. So by the time he proposes again, they're like two different people at that point. Modern enemies to lovers type stories or antagonism to lover really rely on, especially the female main character, just falling in love with the man while he is actively being shitty towards her. Like, that is the bulk of a lot of these antagonism to lovers stories that I see, is a lot of like, well, he sucks, but I don't know, something about him, right? Or he hates everyone and he would burn the world down, but he would also do it for me. And I think that that is missing the two part of enemies to lovers, right? That you have to grow, that you have to change, and that it isn't about these two people just being more comfortable through exposure with each other, but them separately sort of learning things and growing, and that meaning that they fit better together. Mr. Darcy understands what he did wrong and he tries to make it right, even without expectations. He knows enough of Lizzy and how strong her character is and her opinions are that she might never accept him again, but he still wants to do what's right. He still wants to show her that he has changed and that he is capable of change. Lizzy doesn't fix Darcy. Darcy fixes himself. Number 4, Lydia Bennett is such a tragic character, and everybody in the story fails Lydia. It is often easy to sort of downplay that or overlook it because Lydia is also a brat. I think the thing that gets me about her when I'm thinking deeply about this character is her relationship with her sisters. All of her actions I understand from the perspective of her being like almost a child and being raised without boundaries and left to sort of run wild and being rather spoiled by her parents in that regard. In terms of her being able to be out in society and run rather wild, I understand all of that. But the thing that always annoys me most about Lydia is the way that she doesn't think about her sisters or relate to her sisters. And so it's easy to sort of sit in those feelings and highlight that in her interpretations. At the base of this, you have a story about a young girl who was failed by her family in so many meaningful ways. And then when like the consequences of those actions come to a head, there's this like very present worry about what that will mean for them, for their family, for their reputation, while this young girl has been taken away by like a known predator. Mr. and Mrs. Bennett got incredibly lucky with Jane and Lizzy because of their personality and disposition, and they tried that same parenting style on their next 3 children who were different humans, and it didn't give them the result that it gave them with Jane and Lizzy. And so instead of doing anything about that, these are 2 parents that really sort of like gave up at a certain point until we get to Lydia, who we see the most consequences for in terms of this very permissive parenting style. Through the lens of like this time period and these social conventions, Lydia gets a lot of the blame for sort of ruining herself and taking these actions that she doesn't really reckon with, right? She's still living in her la-la land of like having snagged herself this husband. And even at the end, as we're told how Wickham and Lydia live their lives, right? It is almost in this way from the narrator that it's like, and she got what she got, right? And in some regards, you have to think that this is purposeful because we do have Mr. Bennett saying like he feels terrible about his role in all of this, but he knows that it won't last and he'll be over it soon enough. So there is some self-awareness in terms of how they are not taking the responsibility that they should. But the way that the story goes on, it's really easy to sort of like deprioritize that like a huge thing here is about the bad parenting of Mr. and Mrs. Bennett. Number 5, the final couple of chapters of Pride and Prejudice are some of my favorite, and they're almost like impossible to adapt. And so I get why we never quite see these adapted in any way, but I love these final chapters so much. We talk a lot about Austen's letters, right? Mr. Wentworth's letter being very romantic, Mr. Darcy's letter being sort of the opposite. There are a number of really good letters in Pride and Prejudice, and we get a few of them right at the end. I love Mrs. Gardner's letter to Lizzy, where she's explaining Mr. Darcy's role in Lydia's patched up marriage, where she's basically like, girl, you honestly are asking me, you don't know what's going on here? Okay, I'll tell you. And let me just hint that I really like Mr. Darcy, and please don't be mad at me for saying this because I'd love to tour the park at Pemberley. XOXO, your favorite aunt. I love that letter. And at the end where Lizzy is telling Mrs. Gardner their engagement, I love that as well. But we also get a glimpse into what it was like for them to be engaged, right? Lizzy is constantly running interference, so Darcy doesn't have to endure the mortification of her more embarrassing family members. And there's a way that they're learning how to be together. And we do get a lot more tied up ends. So like Lady Catherine eventually just has to accept Lizzy as as Darcy's wife. And so does Caroline Bingley, who finds that it's like worse to hold on to this grudge than to be like excluded from this society. So she has to behave. She has to be nice to Lizzy. Mr. Bennett loves popping up unannounced to Pemberley, which is adorable. And it truly is that not only do we get a happy ending for Lizzy and for Jane, but a lot of the haters of the book just have to kind of like eat their words by the end. Number 6, Mrs. Bennett has a point. Mrs. Bennett is also like mortifying. She's a very embarrassing person to her daughters, and she reacts in these really exaggerated and emotional ways. But at the core of what Mrs. Bennett is saying, she is like absolutely right. She's the only one here that really understands the dangers that her daughters are in. Like Lizzy not accepting Mr. Collins' proposal, marriage proposal, like we understand as readers, but also Mrs. Bennett is right. Like, what do you mean you're not accepting this proposal? We are going to be homeless. We're going to have no money if you don't marry well. And this is like the actual solution to all of our problems. So she's right in her panic and her desperation to try and get her daughters married well. This is why I think Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies is so interesting as an adaptation, because it gives physical form to the looming danger that is actually in Pride and Prejudice, right? For the story, it is destitution for her and her family, which everybody's like, but in Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies, it's like an actual zombie is a looming danger, and it gives it an immediacy that I think is really interesting and very funny for an adaptation. There are also smaller ways that Mrs. Bennett is right that I think are really funny. One of the main things is at the beginning of the story, right? She's like, Netherfield Park is let at last, and she wants Mr. Bennett to go and visit Mr. Bingley immediately because he could marry one of their eligible daughters. They are the principal family in this neighborhood, and so she understands that like putting an eligible bachelor in front of her daughters could mean marriage. And you kind of laugh at that. You laugh at this idea that it's a truth universally acknowledged, right? But in the end, they get married. Putting her very hot daughter in front of this eligible bachelor did in fact end in a marriage. Mrs. Bennett was right. So as much as Mrs. Bennett is sort of over the top with her expressions of her emotions and her nerves and how embarrassing she is and how she sometimes like lacks in decorum, at the heart of what she is saying and what she is trying to achieve, she's right. And number 7, Jane Austen is hilarious. Jane Austen is so funny. And I know people know this, but I think often when we think about classics, there's a way of thinking about them as sort of stuffy. And I think in adaptations, you miss a lot of the humor because a lot of it is coming through the narrator's voice. And so there isn't always a good way to translate the humor that you get through the narration and those interjections into adaptations. But more often than not in her novels, and this is true for Pride and Prejudice, Austen is both like presenting these stories, these love stories, this society, and making fun of it at the same time. In Pride and Prejudice, she's really interested in thinking about like what it means for young people to be in love within the constraints of how that happened during this time, and what does it mean to be violently in love, and what does it mean to marry for gain versus for love. And we see the very different way that Lizzy thinks about that when it comes to her best friend Charlotte, who she can't easily forgive marrying Mr. Collins as much as she was easily able to sort of explain and justify Mr. Wickham getting engaged to Mary King, right? She understood that he needed money to live on, but when it came to her best friend, she was a little more unforgiving. So the story is really interested in all of these dynamics of love and status and social expectation, and in a way that is often sort of like lightly roasting everyone involved. From chapter 1 is full of bangers. There's so many hilarious lines. Mr. Collins is hilarious. Lady Catherine is so funny. And honestly, because we are laughing at them more than we are laughing with them, right? They're presented in this way that we're supposed to understand their absurdity. And the same is true for Mrs. Bennett as well. Mr. Bennett is constantly roasting his own family. Like he's usually on hand to give a little like roast line or two. And then of course we have Lizzy, who is constantly clowning on Mr. Darcy. And that is a big reason why he falls in love with her. That's it for me today. Happy Pride and Prejudice Day. I always love talking to people about Pride and Prejudice. So from you guys, I would would love to hear about some of your favorite details or moments from the story. What are the scenes that stand out to you? How do you feel about the various adaptations? I could talk about this forever. You can ask my Discord. We've actually made this our year of Austen. We usually pick like 1 or 2 big reading projects for us to do, and this year we're reading Austen, and of course we started with Pride and Prejudice in January. It's looking like we're going to read Persuasion in February. So I've been loving having a place to just sort of like put all my thoughts down as I'm rereading. Joining my Discord is a perk of my membership. So for $5 a month, you can support this channel. You can become a member. You can join the Discord. If you're unable to support with $5 a month, you can also just follow me for free on Bindery, and you get my weekly newsletter and any of the reviews or essays that I'm posting over on Bindery. So please, please do check it out and support this channel. And I'm going to go watch some Pride and Prejudice, because why not? It's a Pride and Prejudice day. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys soon. So when people talk about banter in modern romances, I'm like, what do you say? Are we talking Jane Austen banter? Or is it someone forcing a nickname on somebody else? Because I can't do that anymore.